Chapter 4. Out, Out, Out. Jack and Annie hurried around to the back door and slipped inside the house. They walked through a small, dark mud room, then stepped into the large front hallway. Sun slanted through the tall windows. Everything seemed to be made of carved wood or marble. A wide staircase curved up to the second floor. "Get to work, sweeps!" barked the housekeeper. "Do the regular!" Mrs. Tibbs left them and clomped down the back stairs. Jack heard pots clattering below. He realized the kitchen must be in the cellar. The rest of the house was quiet, as if it were waiting for the mother and children to return. "I wonder where Mr. Dickens is writing," Annie whispered. "He must be working quietly somewhere in the house," said Jack. Mrs. Tibbs came bustling up the back stairs and burst into the front hallway. "I told you to get to work," she said. "If I don't see you working in 2 minutes, I'll throw you out on your ears." The housekeeper then disappeared up the wide staircase to the second floor. "I guess we'd better get to work," said Jack. "Where do we start?" said Annie. "Let's check out the fireplaces on this floor," said Jack. Jack and Annie crept into a dining room that overlooked a garden. A fire crackled in the hearth. "She can't expect us to clean that chimney," said Jack, "unless she wants us to burn to death." Jack and Annie went back through the front hall and into a room filled with leather-bound books. There was no fire in that large fireplace, but the room was bright and warm. It had big windows, a rich-colored plush carpet, and mirrors that reflected the light from outside. A vase of fresh flowers sat on a desk facing one of the windows. "Oh, man, I love this room," said Jack, staring at all the books. "Yeah, and look, there's a desk with a feather pen and paper," said Annie. "I'll bet this is where Mr. Dickens does his writing. I wonder where he is." "Maybe he's taking a break," said Jack. "Maybe he'll come in here soon," said Annie. "Let's start cleaning the chimney." "Okay," said Jack, "but first we have to figure out how." He unbuckled the green bag and pulled out the research book. He looked in the index and found chimney sweeps. He turned to the right page and read aloud. In Victorian England, young boys worked as chimney sweeps, cleaning up the soot made by coal fires. It was not only a dirty job, but a dangerous one as well. Oh, great. Jack closed the book. "Good work, Annie. You made us give up our nice clothes and all our money, and you landed us a dirty, dangerous job." "Don't worry," said Annie. "We shoveled coal, washed dishes, and hauled bananas with Louis Armstrong. We can do this." "Yeah, but how do we do it? The book doesn't tell us," said Jack. "Well, we've got a brush, a broom, and rags," said Annie. "Let's start by using them. Remember, we're just waiting to run into Charles Dickens. Then we'll chat with him and play our music and—" Okay, said Jack. He put the book away. Jack and Annie stepped into the hearth. Annie got down on her hands and knees and began scrubbing the stones with the brush. Jack pushed his broom up the chimney and tried to sweep the soot off the bricks. A pile of soft black powder fell on his head. It got in his eyes and mouth. "Oh, no," whispered Jack, puffing and blowing. As he squeezed his eyes shut, he felt Annie yank his sleeve. "Don't," he said. "Shh," whispered Annie. "He's here." Jack opened his watery eyes. He saw a small, slender man standing in the hallway outside the door. The man had wavy brown hair. He wore a dark coat and pants. He was reading some papers and muttering to himself. "Mr. Dickens," whispered Annie. Before Jack could say anything, the man shouted, "Let no one enter my study, Mrs. Tibbs, under penalty of death." And he came into his study and slammed the door. "Penalty of death?" thought Jack. "He's got to be kidding." But he and Annie crouched down in the fireplace. Mr. Dickens didn't notice them or Jack's green velvet bag sitting on the carpet. As he crossed the room, he kept looking at his papers and muttering to himself. He sat down at the desk facing the window. He picked up the feather pen, dipped it into an ink pot, and began to write. Suddenly, Mr. Dickens leapt out of his chair and rushed to one of the mirrors. He put his hands around his neck and cried, "Ugh!" He struggled and made a horrible face as if someone were choking him. Then the writer hurried back to his desk and scrawled a few more lines. He stopped and read what he'd written. Good, he said. Then Mr. Dickens leapt up again and rushed back to the mirror. This time he rapped his head with his knuckles. He looked furious. "Bah, bah, bah!" he shouted. Jack and Annie watched, fascinated. Again, Mr. Dickens hurried back to his desk and wrote. He stopped and read what he'd written. Then he crumpled the paper and threw it across the room. He covered his face with his hands and murmured, I can't. He was still for a long moment. Excuse me, are you okay? Annie asked in a soft voice. Mr. Dickens gasped and whirled around. He saw Jack's green velvet bag on the carpet. What's that? Who's here? Then he saw Jack and Annie huddled in the fireplace. He jumped out of his chair. Chimney sweeps, he cried. Why are you in my study? Sorry, we're just working on the chimney, said Annie. Mr. Dickens groaned. I can't bear it, he said. I have to get out. I have to leave. He rushed across the room and threw open the door. The housekeeper was sweeping in the hallway. What's wrong, Mr. Dickens? She asked. I'm finished for today, Mrs. Tibbs, said Mr. Dickens. They, he pointed back into his study. Mrs. Tibbs saw Jack and Annie. Oh, what are you doing in there? She cried. Mr. Dickens, I'm sorry. Never mind. I'm going out, said Mr. Dickens. Tell Mrs. Dickens I don't know when I'll be back. He grabbed his hat and walking stick. Then he hurried out the front door. Mr. Dickens, don't go, cried Mrs. Tibbs. But the door closed before she could stop him. Mrs. Tibbs whirled around and charged into the room. What are you doing in here, filthy brats? She shrieked. You know you're to start with the back rooms, not his study. Never his study. She waved her broom at them, as if she were trying to sweep them out. Out, out, out! Jack grabbed his green bag. Then he and Annie fled from Mrs. Tibbs and her broom. They hurried out the front door. Mrs. Tibbs followed them to the iron gate. Poor Mr. Dickens, you ruined his day, she cried. I hope that makes you happy. No, it doesn't, said Annie. All of England is waiting for his next story, cried Mrs. Tibbs. Oh, brother, thought Jack. Mrs. Tibbs yanked open the gate. As Jack and Annie tried to slip past her, she grabbed Jack by his jacket. She looked at him closely. Why, you're not Harry! She turned and looked at Annie. And you're not Colin! What have you done with my regular sweeps? She cried. Nothing. They're fine, said Jack. You better not have hurt them, you scamps, she said, pushing Jack and Annie out onto the sidewalk. They're fine, we promise. We're sorry, said Annie. There's no forgiveness for all the harm you've done today, the housekeeper said, looking as if she might burst into tears. Then she pushed the iron gate shut. It slammed with a loud clang.